Thank you. And I congratulate Kidderpore College for organizing this very interestingly titled seminar. And also thank Kidderpore College for having me in this program. Now I will be very brief. In fact, we are behind schedule by I think 15 minutes. And I will try to be brief because already you have heard Professor Chatterjee and Dr. Nanda, who have talked about a number of challenging issues and theoretical perspectives that provides kind of explanation of existing world order. In fact, in my presentation, there will be 5 points to be considered. The first, I would like to discuss why there is a very little chance of World War III. In the second section, I would like to elaborate on the point why there still could be a possibility of World War III. And in the third section, I might kind of focus on the geopolitical shifts and the inevitability of conflicts. And fourth section will be on India's strategic culture, as I understand. And the final section will be on India's global strategy, obviously from academic perspective and not from the perspective of the military professional. Now, the points that I would like you to consider first, that is, there is no perfect state, there is no perfect technology, there is no perfect system or order. So, obviously, we are not really building any kind of perfect system, and there is always this possibility of imperfection, turning into crisis. And as Professor Chatterjee was referring to, crisis of liberalism, crisis of democracy, crisis of world order. And there is a new word that is in fashion these days, that is called perma crisis. That we are in crisis most of the time, permanently under crisis. And therefore, it provides a new kind of attitude, a new kind of approach to the understanding of our existence, our living, our international relations. So we will talk about certain practical considerations, without referring to the theories, because different theories have very different kinds of observations with regard to why there is very little chance of World War III. First thing is, war has evolved over time. So total wars or absolute wars are no longer preferable by any states because of the consequences that a total war might have. That either you win or you lose, and if you lose, it would be well nigh difficult to rebuild your economy. Nobody wants to get back into that kind of situation anymore. Rather, limited wars are preferable, and limited wars in terms of limited targets, limited engagements, confining the wars to a particular zone. These are manageable wars, and these may provide some kind of benefit to the party that starts a war. So, first thing is, total war is out of fashion. Second, we talk about international law, international organizations, taboos and norms, and these are not tremendously effective, but still they exercise some control over most of the states who do not consider themselves to be parties to power struggle. That is, they don't want to get involved in power struggle, and there are plenty of such states in the world, and for them, international law, for them, international organizations, so they have, crucial kind of presence in their relations with other states. Thirdly, there is deterrence, nuclear deterrence. That, when you talk about Pax Atomica, that will live under peace of atom, that is because there are nuclear weapons. States are very apprehensive about the consequences of a nuclear war, and therefore they would not normally try to create such a situation where there would be a possibility of nuclear war. So nuclear war themselves have some kind of restraining effect on state behavior. There is stability paradox that nuclear weapons actually do not rule out any kind of, all kinds of warfare, but nevertheless, once again, there could be small wars, but not really a kind of all-out warfare. And there is another point, that is, unit cost of warfare has escalated exponentially. The kind of expenditure that is made in terms of warfare and what we get in return. What Trump has got in return, what Putin has got in return in Ukraine. Yes, Putin has captured some portion of Ukraine, that is strategically that is beneficial to Russia, but let's say the kind of expenditure Putin has made in terms of financial resources, in terms of human resources, and the war is still continuing. So this unit cost of war, that is the calculation that we generally make, what would be beneficial for us. It has escalated in such a way that war sometimes is viewed as essentially a waste of money. And when we talk about the world wars, remember, the parties to the World War I and World War II, except Imperial Japan and United States, were mostly European states. And these European states had colonies in different parts of the world, or for that matter, if you think of United Kingdom, the British Commonwealth naturally had, those Australia, New Zealand, and other such, common, members of Commonwealth nations, all got involved in these warfares of the colonial masters, and therefore these became world wars. Today's situation is entirely different, in the sense that there are no colonies to be sucked into the conflicts of their colonial masters. Secondly, almost all of these countries are now democratic states. Though democracy is in crisis, they are not perfect democracies, and they are all flawed democracies, including United States, India. These are all, regarded as flawed democracy. But nevertheless, these are democratic states. There are not many great powers, in true sense of the term, that might use imperialism or hegemonic policies to fulfill their objectives. In fact, most states, they now show the tendency of not getting involved in other people's war. Trump wanted, requested these European countries, and Trump instigated those European countries, saying many things. Nobody actually, seemed interested in getting involved in this present Gulf War. So there is very little chance of World War III. That would be the conclusion from this kind of discussion. But none of these above statements that I have made provide a guaranteed fail-safe system. If you talk about deterrence, if you talk about international organization, if you talk about cost of war, if you talk about, no preference for total war, but nevertheless, they cannot guarantee that there would always be peace. Miscalculations can lead to inadvertent warfares. Now, one can bring down too many states. If you consider Germany made all kinds of miscalculations, and you cannot expect a state that would fight for long years against a combined strength of, say, USA, Russia, Soviet Union at that point of time, and other major powers, and in terms of resources, in terms of weapons. But what happened ultimately? Germany was defeated. It was obvious to all that Germany would be defeated in the long run. But Germany brought down all other major powers of Europe. So there is this issue always that you do not want war, you do not want to get involved in war, you try to avoid all kinds of war, but because of miscalculation of X or Y, you might get involved in this kind of warfare. And since states have this duty to protect its citizens, its political independence, territorial integrity, fundamental values, states obviously are very sensitive about security, and therefore armed forces and weapons would always be necessary. States would always try to accumulate strength. And as you all know, this leads to security dilemma. There is always mistrust, there is always tension, and there would always be conflict. Now, there is also mismatch between what people say and what people do. That is, the statesman would always talk about international peace, world peace, nuclear weapons, etc., etc. Barack Obama talked about a nuclear-free world and he got a Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, I cannot blame Trump for trying so hard to get a Nobel Peace Prize. Because Barack Obama just got this Nobel Peace Prize while he was killing a number of people in Afghanistan. Anyway, the idea is that there are therefore various mismatches between promise and performance. International monitoring system is weak, and the big powers would all of this. And this is perhaps because of my proclivity to believe in realist kind of prescriptions. And these big powers would always create problems in international politics. And America is viewed as the source of instability in contemporary system, but the idea is, can you sideline America? There are, this kind of debate whether we can shift the headquarters of the United Nations to some other south, global south country, whether we can fund various programs of the United Nations, because USA has already withdrawn from a lot many, kind of international agencies. I think 66 international agencies. US is not paying any money to World Health Organization. US has withdrawn support from all kind of climate financing, world peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping missions. So, well, the third world countries or the global south countries should now come forward and think about a new kind of international organization that can be established and can be funded by the third world countries. Now, if we think about the geopolitical shifts, you must be aware of these slow and constant movements of tectonic plates that glide over the upper mantle of the earth. And when there is a collision, when there are slips, there are earthquakes, and we feel the tremors. Now, international geopolitics in a way is similar to that. That states would always try to adjust with one another. They would, kind of have smaller, kind of cooperation, sometimes conflict, competition, and there will be constant tussle among states. And whenever there is this slip, you cannot predict that. Whenever there is this slip, there is this collision, you might find, geopolitical earthquakes. And essentially, if we can extend this kind of analogy, is, earthquake below magnitude 4 is considered to be safe. So you'll find some of the conflicts below magnitude 4. From 5, it starts causing damage. So you can make certain gradations of these conflicts as well. For example, you might find that at 4.5, the conflict between Cambodia and Thailand with 100 deaths. Then at 7 or 7.5, Israel's attack on Gaza and with around 75,000 deaths. Or you might have magnitude 10 plus, huge magnitude, where you have this kind of World War II where there were deaths of 70 million. So we cannot predict earthquakes. Likewise, we cannot predict when exactly will there be a war. There will be fault lines, there are many situations of potential wars, but we can predict that there will be a war. And these shifts that take place all the time, in fact, throughout the history of international relations. Let me just say now there is this shift from Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. That everybody knows these days, that this would be Asian century, this is no longer Eurocentric, the world is becoming Asia-centric. And there is this famous saying that is attributed to the Belgian peer, Paul Henry Spaak. He actually said that, in Europe today, there are two types of states. Small states and states that are yet to realize that they are small. So essentially, Europe is no longer important. And important, obviously, is Asia and China, India, and non-Western certain global South states that have emerged as important economic, political, and military actors. So naturally, the way we understood world politics from the Western perspective, this is also shifting because the values of these Asian states, though there will be a debate about Asian values, and there will be, the approaches, the attitudes of these Asian states are somewhat different from the Western countries. So the Western prescriptions might not work here when we talk about this Asian century. And here, obviously, another important aspect is that any kind of hegemonic attempts, coercive measures, economic or military, are being resisted, diplomatically or militarily, but no attempt of hegemony is, is kind of accepted by the other powers. Because, just referring to Foucault, that in every power relationship, there is a party over which power is exercised. And there will be a resistance from that particular party. And this resistance is very clear now in the contemporary period. If we talk about realism and Morgenthau, then obviously the idea was that power would be exercised over other parties. But the response, this retaliation, it is becoming more prominent, becoming more clearly visible in contemporary period, because small states are also in a way improving their status. I will just very briefly refer to two aspects. That is, one is India's strategic culture, as I understand. And, strategic culture, it's a kind of area that is very debatable, and it is open to interpretations. But I'll very briefly summarize what I understand as India's strategic culture. That, here we have the trajectories of peace and conflict intertwined. If you look into our past heritage, that is Ramayana, Mahabharata, Manusmriti, or everything, everywhere you would find that realist ideas are somewhat matched by idealist positions. And there is always a focus on the middle path. That means ahimsa or non-violence is desirable, but to repulse the evil, you need to use force. That is the basic idea, and therefore real politics is enmeshed in moral politics. So the strategic culture that we have is essentially non-provocative, non-predatory, non-hegemonic, but use of force is viewed as necessary under certain circumstances, essentially dharma to repulse the evil. So India has to maintain optimum war preparedness, but it would have a defensive orientation. Like that we would have nuclear weapons, all right? But we also have a kind of doctrine called go first use. That there would not be a kind of projection of hegemonic or predatory kind of policies, but there would be, of course, a kind of military preparedness that is generally necessary for the protection of the state, but at the same time there would be some kind of, we might say, some kind of layer, some kind of packaging presenting it, something like Ashok, Ashok the Great, who advocated dharma vijay after he abolished his enemies, that is, defeated his enemies, conquered Kalinga, and then suddenly he changed from Chandraseka, he became Dharmashak, and obviously he became Ashoka the Great in history because he could show the human face of power. So the idea is that right now India has an eye on economic development, that is Vikashit Bharat by 2047. So India stays away from the power struggle and alliance formation, and therefore security for India consists in reducing the possibilities of conflict and warfare through dialogue and diplomacy. That is what India projects, that is what India advocates, and this era is not the era of war, that is what our Prime Minister has said, or for that matter, we pursue a policy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. All these will fit into this very scheme. What China at one point of time did, China used to say we need 30 years of peace to develop ourselves, and there was always this question of what would China do on the 31st year? And China became assertive under Xi Jinping. So I don't know what would happen in 2048, but the very idea is we now want peace, a period of peace in order to develop ourselves. So naturally, there are certain considerations that we understand that security can be best achieved by constantly working on the reduction of possibilities of violence. That we continue to do. But at the same time, naturally, we would have our military, pragmatic, collaborative platforms short of military alliance. We do not like the word military alliance. We are non-aligned forever. I think Ashley has said that. But we have something like, if we have Quad or if we have quasi-alliance with the United States like DEMOA, Kolkata, Beta, Trump is aberration. Trump will go away, or Trumpism will go away after a few years or 2 years roughly, because India is officially designated as the major defense partner of the United States. And obviously, though we have our close relations with Russia, that remains a somewhat trusted friend, and almost 60% of India's defense equipment is of Russian origin. So the idea is the way we are trying to formulate our foreign policy is not by damaging or in a way hampering our security preparedness. Rather, as Dr. Nanda was referring to, Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, we are producing our certain weapons, we have prohibited import of certain weapons, our DRDO, etc. The kind of ecosystem that we have developed, we are producing arms, we are exporting arms, and obviously it is a top arms importer. And therefore, as a fourth largest firepower, that is India's right now, I don't think India lacks military preparedness. Obviously, people would like to have more defense budget and things like that. But nevertheless, India is following, kind of a track that is, I think, perhaps suits the rise of a new democratic superpower. I think the good point is, I conclude thereby, that we do not expect really a World War III, but there is every possibility of different types of conflicts now and then. Like, as I have said, like earthquakes, we fail to predict war, but conflicts in various forms are a reality, these are expected, and ordinarily India would push for dialogue and diplomacy to resolve disputes, but one should always remain prepared for surprises and shocks. That is the nature of international politics. India has an alert military force, and an alert military force will always have contingency plans to tackle these surprises and shocks. Thank you very much for your attention.